I'm going to see you soon.
This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm very pleased to move on to our next invited talk um, from Seán Lacey in Ireland. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce him as a fellow mathematician. I have to always do a shout out to those of us who have actually invested the incredible time, energy, and effort it takes to get a PhD in mathematics. So, but Seán has gone on to do plenty of other things, including statistics, and most importantly, is committed to truth and science and integrity in research, and met him through his work that he published in Scholarly Communications Journal of Research Metrics and Analytics. So, with that introduction, Seán, please.
Super. Thanks very much, Carl. Hi, everyone, and so it's happy local time to everyone. It's 6 o'clock here in the evening in Ireland, and I hope everyone's keeping well. It's interesting just to hear Carl's introduction. It's mad. It's only when somebody says it you kind of think back to it that my PhD was in applied maths over nearly 20 years ago now at this rate, and in the university I did my PhD was there was very much maths, applied maths kind of area, and then statistics. And statistics was seen as the dark side. And it's just, I think my PhD supervisor now would probably be hanging his head in shame to know that I ended up kind of stepping over to the dark side and started dwindling in statistics, But when you're young and you have a family and there's a job there, you kind of take it and you worry about other things later on. So anyway, so look, I'm the Research Integrity and Compliance Officer for Munster Technological University. It's a university that we have in the southwest of Ireland. And prior to the role, I'm in the role nearly 4 years actually, which is again crazy to think how fast time goes. But prior to the role, then I was a senior lecturer in the Department of Mathematics in Munster Technological University. And I'm here to talk about grokking the data, hearing each other, fostering scholarly dialogue through sound statistics and civil discourse. And very honoured to be invited to speak. Carl has been my main point of contact for this, and he definitely pushed me with what to how to maybe thinking about this, because ultimately when you're asked to do a presentation that's like 45 minutes long, you have to put serious thought into it. So what I'm looking at how I'm going to approach this talk is kind of threefold, and hence the mathematician in me now is coming out straight away. I'm going to talk about the statistics side of it, like what is sound statistics, and how do we have sound statistics? How do we end up generating that? And then I'm going to move into the idea of the discourse, which is communicating the statistical results, obviously in this case. And then the third part to this talk will be where I'm just going to focus maybe on, I suppose, how my learnings down through the years in statistics and civil discourse have informed my own research and the research I do to date, and research that ultimately led to the introduction with Carl. And I suppose one final thing then before I kick off, and again, it's just prior to the, before starting this talk, it'd be kind of, different things wander through your mind. And I was just thinking, wait a second, Carl, as far as I know anyway, is in California. And I was thinking, it's mad. 19 years ago, would you believe to the day I was in California on my honeymoon, which is just mad how things can happen. But anyway, less about that and more about grokking the data, hearing each other, and so on. So what I thought would be maybe just useful is maybe to kind of my take on grokking the data. And for these slides, I try to use slides that are not too text heavy. I try to have slides that would have images, and some of the images I've generated through Copilot because I wanted things in particular. And some of the images obviously are just things I would have taken from the web, would have taken from the Brain Health Alliance webpage and different things, and always try to give the appropriate attribution as well. But when it comes to grokking the data, and I suppose aligning it with integrity, I'd often see it as, there's the two demands to integrity in the topic of grokking the data and hearing each other. And that will be around the idea of rigorous analysis and respectful dialogue. That you can't grok the data without having rigorous analysis. You can't hear each other without respectful dialogue. And I suppose they're the two things that would have really kind of, I suppose, would underpin a lot of my work, even to date, even though as I migrated away from statistics, the dark side, into being a research integrity and compliance officer. And obviously, when I talk about those two aspects, that's obviously with a focus on this particular talk. When we talk about integrity in total, we obviously have honesty, we've respect, we've reliability, we have accountability. There's obviously principles around research integrity, and those 4 principles that I called out there, they would be very much taken from our European Code of Conduct, which is what we generally signpost to in Ireland as well. I'm happy now to, I know now there's a Q&A section at the end, but if anyone ever wants to interrupt me and ask a question as we're going through it, I don't mind being interrupted. There's no problem whatsoever, so please feel free. But ultimately, why does this matter? I suppose, returning to the title, like, why do we have Grokking the data and then the civil discourse? And ultimately, when we generate numbers can be confusing. Some people look at numbers and they're delighted. All they want to see are the numbers and they can go from there. But others, when they see the numbers, they get confused. And what's very important in that research journey that we can be on is that we're able to communicate our findings in a concise manner, in a clear manner. And that's down to often having that kind of civil discourse that we're looking for. So ultimately, data is not just numbers. Interpretation does matter, and that's always something that I try to show my students, that it's great that you're able to generate your output in statistics, potentially using Python or, but then it's about how do you communicate that. Just because the computer tells you something, is what it tells you, is it actually is it correct? Is your interpretation even correct as well? And this is where you want to engage with others and kind of have that discourse as well. So in my mind then, what does it mean to actually grok the data? And I suppose one thought that comes to my mind when I was preparing for this, there was a colleague of mine in another university in Ireland who actually was born in America, Dr. Darren Daly. If you're on social media and stuff, he goes by the handle of StatSepi, so you might have come across him. But he gave a talk a good few years ago, and one thing he said to me, which always stuck to me, and I bet you a picture of him coming up there later, but he said, how do you know there's no problem with your data unless you go looking for the problem? And that's something I've always kind of remembered, and I've always tried to encourage my students, to think of. Look, you can't say your data is okay unless you look for problems. You first look for problems. If you don't find problems, then your data is okay. So how do we look for problems? Well, we grok the data. What we do is we look at it deeply. We don't just look at the surface understanding, as in pop open an Excel file. Yeah, I don't see any missing values there. It all seems fine. The 1s and 2s are all there. We don't look at that. We need to go deeper in it. We need to maybe look at exploring the data, looking at how one measurement compares to another measurement, or maybe even one measurement compares to another measurement, which compares to another measurement. This idea of kind of Simpson's paradox comes to mind, which is something I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes as well. So we can't, I suppose, have that kind of, I suppose, confidence in our data if we just look at it superficially. If we don't go deep in it, we can't have that confidence. And then it's the case of what would be some pitfalls that I'd be kind of flagging to my students when it comes to when you're looking at your data. And I suppose it's natural that when you're doing your analysis, like you have a research question, you have a research hypothesis, you kind of wanted to go in a particular direction. So you have to be careful to ensure, look, that the data is actually telling you what you want it, what it should tell you, and you're not maybe having your own kind of confirmation bias when it looks at when you're going to your own interpretation. And how do you avoid that? How do you safeguard against that kind of confirmation bias? Is by having a discourse with others about it and being open for criticism or critiquing. That would really help. It's also careful that when we're looking at our results that we don't cherry pick. It's ultimately so in Europe we call them unacceptable research practices, and I think in the States they're called questionable research practices. And this is where we cherry pick, where we look at our results that are statistically significant. We look at results, we only report results that confirm our hypothesis. But we need to be looking at the other side. We need to be looking at negative results. And obviously then that can be an issue in itself, as I say that, because some journals don't want to see negative results. And that's a problem. That's most definitely a problem. But hopefully a culture is changing in that area as well. But ultimately, returning to this point here, we try not to cherry pick. We try to look at our results and kind of see how does it align with our research hypothesis or our research question. And I suppose just to kind of see maybe where we're going with this, then, like, I am very much an applied person. I'm not for kind of pontificating to people, oh, don't do this, don't do this. I'd be kind of more for, well, how do you do it? How do we do it correctly? So, and that's ultimately where this is the direction we're going here as well. So this is not me just kind of saying all these pitfalls. It's then going to be kind of, from my experience, how do we avoid all these pitfalls as well? So that's kind of coming up in the next couple of slides as well. And sorry, just I didn't mention the third point there of ignoring context. We can't forget, which I've already mentioned, research question or research hypothesis. We can't forget that. Like we should ideally, when we're doing our research, we should ideally have our hypothesis. We should be avoiding this thing called harking, hypothesis after results are known. So, and how we do that is making sure that we have given the appropriate thought in advance. And obviously that helps with grokking the data. And then the final thing, I suppose, would be, how do we do it then? Now this is not the complete how-to yet, but you're looking at exploring your data. You're ultimately looking for the problem. That's how I'd always say, you look for the problem, and hopefully you don't find a problem. And you could look at the problem numerically, by running off means, standard deviations, frequency tables, or you could look at the data, look for problems visually. Visually is probably easier if you have a large volume of data, but people have their own strengths when it comes to this interpretation. And I never underestimate the importance of domain knowledge, which is kind of that gut feeling, that gut understanding. I would think it's obviously something that develops over time as well. That, experience. So when you're looking at data, do you see a problem or not? And obviously there's a skill in that develops. But ultimately, I'd often kind of say to my students, it's a case of, look, you might have a gut feeling, and then you generate the statistics. And does the statistics align with your gut? If it does, then you're maybe moving in the right direction. But if the statistics are not aligning with your gut, pause, reflect. What's gone wrong? Is it that the statistics, did you generate the wrong statistics? Or maybe is your own gut understanding off? But it's to kind of pause, reflect, and kind of see, look, how can you get them aligned, if possible? Because ultimately, you just want to ensure that you don't have an error. So I suppose I was trying to think, what did I want to appear here? I would, this is, again, that colleague of mine, Darren Daly, who you'll think, no, he a great time for, which I do, I have a great time and great respect for him. But he gave me this analogy before when it comes to grokking the data. Now, he wouldn't have used the word grokking, but you kind of get the idea that it's kind of when you look at your overall analysis that you do in statistics, what most people see is the findings. They see the output. They see the success. Now, you could nearly argue that this could be the same in competitive sports as well. People see the person putting their hands up in the air, crossing the line, or scoring the goal or the touchdown, but they don't necessarily see all the training that's happened behind the scenes, the sacrifices, the early to bed, early up in the morning, and things like that. I try not to go too off course now for you here, but I suppose when it comes to the statistics, most people will see will see your findings. Hopefully, you're publishing your findings and so on, but they don't necessarily see all the work that you've done behind the scenes. They don't see the grokking of the data. Nobody will see that. They won't see, look, all the troubleshooting that you might try to do, the turning it upside down, inside out, to see, are there any pitfalls, are there any errors with it? Because obviously they need addressed before you do the analysis. So often when it comes to that whole time that you spend in grokking the data, unfortunately, you sometimes don't, I suppose, get the reward kind of in a paper or an outputs for it. It's ultimately something that you say that you've done. But what I would say to somebody is, and to my research students, is when you grok the data, it gives you confidence. When you're presenting it, you present with confidence because you've troubleshooted, you've looked for problems, you can find problems, and then you've progressed. Or you've looked for problems, you found problems, you address them, and then you progress. But then when you're presenting and you're looking at your civil discourse, which we're going to come to, you're doing it with confidence because you have a trust in your own ability, and that basically speaks to the rigorous analysis that you've applied. When you look at common pitfalls in data interpretation, and this is something I got from Copilot as well, I just thought a couple of examples would be useful to kind of look where somebody maybe, I think when somebody has experience and they've gone through the journey enough times or traveled the road enough times, then they're in a good place. But if you're looking at maybe an early career researcher or somebody that maybe isn't overly strong in statistics, how do we help them in that case? And so different things that people could see. Somebody could look at a graph and say the trend is declining. But maybe a more careful wording around it is, look, it's more of a slight decrease that you have. Now, obviously, these are just text that we're looking at here. Other ones could be, it's only 15%. That's not too many. It's 15%. 15% is not a lot, but that's actually 150 people out of 1,000, which is a lot, depending on obviously what we're testing for. You could have a conclusion, look, there are all separate events. But maybe should you be looking at putting forward the argument, but they could be related. We collected the data as separate events, but actually, as we did our analysis, we found out that they actually could be related. Is that something that we'd have? So we have our findings, and then we have kind of on the left-hand side with kind of, I suppose, preliminary or kind of surface interpretation. While if you have it maybe on the right-hand side, sorry, findings, I don't know that I say my side right or incorrectly there for you, and apologies if I did. But on the left-hand side, we've the kind of this findings that would be kind of that surface interpretation. While on the right-hand side, you have maybe the findings from a bit of discourse or maybe a deeper interpretation. So you could look at, I won't spend too much more time on this because everyone can read them in their own time as well, but no one reported any issues, but only 10% of people responded. So you always have to be kind of careful with this. And I always say to my researchers is, when you're conducting your research, can be very tunnel visioned, because you're trying to do one thing, but it's so important that you look left and right. And I'd often say this to research students that, would be maybe looking at doing presentations or doing vivas or something like that, where you're going to be put through the mill and ask questions, that it's important that you don't just look straight, that you can look at left and right to different types of avenues that you might have gone down. And then just the last kind of trivial example that I have here of misread data, it doubled from 2 to 4. The flip side of that is the sample size is small. And this is, I suppose, where communicating your findings maybe in an informal environment can help with correct interpretations. And on that then, I suppose, I just wanted to kind of pause and look, we can see how we're going with time here, but actually I can see the time is going quite well or fast here. So I thought it might be just useful, not necessarily for us to delve into a dilemma now here, but I thought it might be just useful for me to share how do I kind of get conversations going with my students at times, so sometimes I present results and ask them, look, can they critique this? What do they see as a problem? Sometimes I present these dilemmas and ask them, look, how do they feel that they'd handle this? And I get some of these dilemmas from the Dilemma Game app. Carl is going to share the slides later on, and you'll have a link. If you click on the image, there's a link to the Dilemma Game. It's an app from a university in Rotterdam in the Netherlands in Europe, and I found it very useful for these kind of dilemma scenarios, which when it comes to my students, I find it just really, really good as a catalyst to get a conversation going, to get them used to actually having a dialogue, to kind of, which is obviously feeding into that discourse idea. I find it very useful. So I'll quickly read it and then kind of show you a couple of example scenarios, and then we kind of go from there. But I'm very happy to circle back at the Q&A later on as well. But here, so a dilemma that I'd often kind of give, or not often, but I sometimes use for my students is, you're doing research in cooperation with a prestigious private partner. During the process, however, you discover that this partner has a secret agenda. They deliberately use your research to their own advantage by prioritizing outcomes advantageous to their own agenda, whilst neglecting other results that could contradict these positive outcomes. What do you do? And I'd often kind of, I suppose, I'd say to my students is, this to me now is obviously coming at it with the stats angle, that often I would, in my role or previous role, would have collaborated with industry to, doing statistical reports and stuff. And when you collaborate with industry, they are hoping findings will go in a particular way. And when you produce a report and the findings are going in the opposite way, it can lead to a lot of unhappiness. So this kind of scenario that we have here in the dilemma is something that's quite real also. So different scenarios that I give them here then is, you do nothing. The private partner can decide how to deal with the results, and you do not want to put this project into jeopardy. So ultimately, you don't open up any kind of discourse. You request a meeting with the partner to address the issue and to explain the importance of the independence of science. So here, there was obviously discussion being had. You withdraw from the research to safeguard your academic reputation, avoiding discourse. You discuss what to do with the head of research of your department, looking for a discourse again. And I suppose I'd always kind of flag then that, I mean, when you look around the room, and obviously we're in a virtual room here, how you handle this is very much dependent on your own experience. Like when I think now, to me, in my current role, I kind of know what direction I'd go. 20 years ago, if I was in this situation, what would I do? I'm not 100% sure, to be honest. And I suppose the decision can often deviate depending on where in your career you are. And I'd often kind of say that to the students as well, and often say to the students that this this can be quite I suppose, a stressful situation to be in, and it's often to maybe look for support. But ultimately, I suppose the scenarios here, this is where I was going to go with the app. It's a nice app because what it does, after you've given your opinion, it then kind of tells you, look, how generally people have responded to it, and it gives you an expert review as well. And what you can kind of see, and what it kind of ties in nicely with this presentation title, I feel, is the main ones are B and D in this case, which in my mind, they're both about having a dialogue, opening up a discourse, talking about it. And to me, I think that is useful then for students that you see. And then I kind of say to the students, well, a way of avoiding all this, and this is kind of me now with the applied hat on, is by having a statistical analysis plan. Like if you look at having a statistical analysis plan at the start of your journey and before you actually do any data analysis, especially when you're collaborating, if you have an analysis plan in place and everyone agrees to the analysis plan, then it ultimately provides you with a nice clear roadmap and everyone is on the same page to how the analysis will actually be done. And if there's going to be a deviation from that, well, now you have a safety net that can say, well, why are we going down this route when we all agreed that this is how we're going to be doing the analysis at the very start? So this kind of very much ties in with the idea of maybe doing pre-registrations of studies, which we see are very popular as well. But ultimately, this safeguards, I suppose, the integrity of science in that it will avoid p-hacking. So where you'd be looking at your data left and right, upside, inside out, and so far like that to find a small p-value. It would avoid hacking, where you generate your hypothesis after you know your results. It would avoid kind of post hoc rationalization as well, because you ultimately have your research question defined, you have your hypothesis, and so on. It promotes transparency and reproducibility. This is how we are going to be conducting our work, and everyone signs off on it at the start. It allows analysis to be consistent. And a line that I like to use with my students is, and this really, I suppose, links in with integrity as well. Like integrity in my mind often is about having plans in place. It could be a research data management plan that you have in place. It could be your ethics application, which obviously speaks to having a plan, a statistical analysis plan. You might have authorship agreements in place. All these plans, they all take time at the start, but they really help underpin the integrity of your research as well. Here, I know I'm just because there's a couple of things I want to show, but so I won't dwell on this slide too long because I want to make sure I get to the later points as well. But different things in the statistical analysis plan, and when I look around the room here, I can see that people with experience. So I'd imagine that a lot of people would be familiar with this. But these are things that I would obviously kind of tell my students that the reason we have an analysis plan is it gives a roadmap. This is where we're going. And then on the left-hand side here are different attributes that to an analysis plan. Maybe if I focus on one in particular without highlighting it, will be the fourth one. How do we handle missing data and outliers? Very, very important. Because sometimes people say, oh, it's an outlier, we should remove it. But like the outlier could be a correct reading as well. So should we be leaving it in? And ultimately, it's a case of before we go off and engage in start the analysis, before we see our results, we should have a decision, well, how are we going to handle outliers? Before we look at the data, how will we handle missing data? Is the participant just dropped from the study, or do we impute? We should have those conversations as well. And actually just have a link there. So the image there is generated by Copilot, but I suppose I just thought it might be useful. Like I have resources created around statistical analysis planning. Maybe it's something that some people in the room or maybe future watchers to this recording might be interested in. So there's just a link to some resources that I've created there with a colleague called Vincent. And then maybe I thought to just bring it to an end, this first part of the session here is I just thought it might be interesting, if everyone just maybe paused and thought for a couple of seconds, because I'm conscious of time, to know if they have engaged in statistics, have they done a statistical analysis plan? And sometimes, like if you've done a statistical analysis plan, maybe in a collaboration, when has it been done? Has it been done before the data analysis has started, as in before the data has been collected, or has it been after? And the reason I put that in, pose that question, and you can come back to me in the Q&A on it if you wish, is because of this. So this is the famous Darren Daly that I mentioned. But why I put this picture in here is because he runs a statistical data analysis unit in another university in Ireland, and this is one of the pictures that he has up on his on the wall, and it very much kind of speaks to when you're looking at I suppose getting involved in a study and maybe doing the statistics for an actual study. Like, if you're often, the running joke with statisticians is you're brought in at the very end when all the data is collected, when all the, and they want you out to kind of to basically maybe solve the problem, but maybe they've collected the data incorrectly. Maybe the research instrument they've used has been inaccurate, and so you're looking at coming in at the end and nearly trying to diffuse the problem to a certain extent. While maybe if they brought you in at the very start, you actually can help with the analysis plan, you can help with the data collection. And this, the quip here with this, and I won't read it out, but I think you can get it as a bit of a joke, is the earlier you bring in the statistician, the cheaper it actually is, because they have a better influence on the I suppose, ultimately good practice. So then I'll just touch on a couple of things here when it comes to sound statistics, like what helps inform sound statistics. Well, if you have sound statistics, which is where you have your potential roadmap, it ultimately helps with reproducibility, which is super important in the open science world that we live in now. It helps, I suppose you have a direction around significance. Now, it's not all about significance, and I have a slide about that in a couple of minutes as well. It helps inform about errors. It's so important to think about errors. Like, what is the error with our data? Because ultimately, if we're doing statistics, there has to be error with it. Otherwise, it's not statistics that we have. Otherwise, they're parameters that we're dealing with. We're dealing with population numbers as opposed to numbers from samples. So if there's numbers from samples, which are statistics, that means there has to be errors with it. And often it will be a case of you look at the quantitative and then the qualitative. The discourse could be seen as the qualitative as well. Here, I just put up a couple of things. I won't dwell on this too long because there are a couple of slides I want to kind of get to later on. But here for this one, I felt it's definitely something I'd always kind of look at in my research collaborations, is it's not all about statistical significance. Significance, basically, which is this magic p-value being small, ultimately tells you that your result is reliable. It doesn't tell you how great your result is or how important or how groundbreaking it actually is. If you want to know the strength of your result, you need to go a step further and you need to measure this thing called an effect size. And that ultimately helps with your sound statistics, which is linking back into the title that we have here as well. Then here are just a couple of graphics that I had. I just thought it would be useful to see, look, how do we measure uncertainty when we have quantitative data? But then I was more so, it wasn't so much this slide, it was more the next slide I thought to me was kind of important, because sometimes people can often just think of the numbers. They can think of, your Excel file. They might necessarily think of the transcripts you might have from focus groups or interviews, and you can have errors there as well. And you do statistics on transcripts as well. Like, you do that, you basically are doing qualitative analysis there. So here is just how we measure uncertainty for quantitative data. We ultimately have our error bars. We have our confidence intervals, and we report those. We don't just report, look, here's our mean, end of story. We report the mean plus and minus, whether it's an error, a standard error, or a margin of error. That is rigorous analysis. When it comes to qualitative data, and I'll just pop up a couple of things here just to see them, just kind of, I suppose, for me, it's just important that we don't forget the qualitative side of the house, that when you're looking at transcripts or you're looking at text data, how you are interpreting it is very much dependent on, should be dependent on the context, should be dependent on the perspective, and so on. It's very much impacted by your own positionality, and there's no way of avoiding that. And that's the nature of qualitative research, is the interpretation of the transcript. It's through your eyes, so it's going to be, it automatically has your bias, but you don't actually call it bias, and you're actually not encouraged to call it a bias. Instead, you're recommended to call it your positionality or your reflexivity. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you just call it out. You don't hide it. You call it out in the methods of your paper, of what your researcher positionality and reflexivity is. And ultimately, then that feeds into the perspectives, that when you're looking at, when you ask, I suppose, a question, when you have open-ended kind of questions, and you're looking at that kind of transcript data or that text data, that there are kind of, you're looking at people that are coming from multiple different realities. They have multiple different perspectives, and you need to take that into account. And ultimately, that is kind of, it's not a margin of error, because we're not dealing with quantitative data, but it would be seen as a limitation with the actual data that you have as well. A couple of images that I just thought it might be just useful to see some fallacies and pitfalls here. I won't go through, I will see now as we go. This one here, because I mentioned Simpson's paradox earlier. This is kind of one that was taken from Berkeley back in 1973. They were saying, look, that there was gender bias so the table on the left, that more males were being admitted to Berkeley than females. This is way back in the 70s, I think 73 or 75, if I remember correctly. While that analysis, which was done basically a cross-tabulation, chi-square test to determine it, you would think that's fair enough. But they didn't go another layer. Like if they looked at the men and women applications, or admission rate, but broke it down by department, they'd actually would have seen, look, that there was actually a higher rate of women being admitted to certain departments over males. And actually, that's that kind of correction. And this highlighted very much Simpson's paradox, which is kind of how you'd ultimately encounter that is if you grokked the data. But from Simpson's paradox here, it basically kind of actually showed that there was actually more of a leaning towards females being admitted than males to the various departments. And there was statistical significance in some of those cases. But that's just a case of, look, a pitfall. If we don't grok the data correctly, like the computer told us the left-hand side, we didn't think it was wrong. But actually, if we did deeper analysis, we would have ended up with the right-hand side as well. I'll leave that one go. This one here is probably one quite close to home. Hopefully not something too sensitive. But this is something that we would have seen on President Trump's Instagram page at one time. Obviously very sensationalized, but this is how we see people using statistics. And ultimately, it all comes down to, and you'd see this so often, especially in newspapers, to where's the zero? Like they're not scaling it correctly. And obviously it's quite sensational because you look at the graph, it nearly seems like double as opposed to the true 48, 51%. I really like this one. I came across this actually last night. I was tweaking around, playing around with the slides, and I came across this from a link from the Brain Health Alliance webpage. I really thought this was nice. Just like the funny sides of it, of basically how people can make mistakes with numbers, ultimately mixing up the units here is what we're seeing, which I thought was funny. And just the last one, I just felt it would be an obvious one to leave out if I left it out, so it was important to kind of put it in, which is basically correlation does not imply causation. And that's obviously quite a common term that you have, but it's something to be aware of as well. So here, there found out there to be a correlation between the number of Google searches for J.K. Rowling and Coca-Cola's stock prices. Fair enough, there's a correlation, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other. And that's obviously where statistics can go wrong as well. And how do we avoid that going wrong? That's where we can have this discourse, okay? And I suppose what I try to encourage with my students, and I signpost them to a particular webpage, which I'll show you as well, that when it comes to this discourse, it's about having, I suppose, proper etiquette to a certain extent, that you want to listen to people before you respond. You want to critique the method, not necessarily the person. You don't try to not take it personally, and you be inclusive and try to, I suppose, and look at different perspectives. They're kind of the three things that I would try to really encourage people when they're looking at that civil discourse, after looking at their sound statistics, when they're sharing the findings, where are they actually going? And ultimately here, and this kind of a small bit of, I suppose, a flip to kind of seeing how a dialogue or a discourse can really help with your interpretation. And I suppose in my mind, when I was looking at the table on the left-hand side here, I was thinking like the left-hand column is like my findings in my publication. The right-hand column is like my discussion in my publication. So in the papers. So facts and figures, so I'm stating them, but then I'm giving the nuances and the context then in the discussion. There's statistical trends that will obviously be important to present if they're accurate and they're truthful, but then I should maybe open it to different viewpoints in my discussion as well. And that's what's important, and very important, to be critiquing and to be critical in the discussion, which is obviously one of the big things that AI can't do for us here. And the only reason I mention that is because I have a slide later on about AI, and I suppose it's hard not to do a talk without mentioning AI these days as well. And I suppose you might have quantitative outputs in your findings, but it's important to really critique them and look at other subjective insights in your actual discussion as well. And ultimately, the combination of that, what it leads to is kind of responsible storytelling. And responsible is a word that's obviously bandied around or used a lot. We're looking at responsible research, we're looking at responsible dissemination. It's equally important to responsible storytelling as well, that we are actually telling our story well and with responsibility. And that's often when I look at outputting different, I suppose, giving advice to students, I would say, look, they're on a journey and it is a story that they're actually telling. And that's trying not to romanticize it too much, but ultimately it is reality. Like the research study that you're doing, it is a journey, whether you're a student or a senior researcher, and ultimately you are trying to tell a story. And when you tell that story, you want to be truthful when you tell that story, and you want to do it in a concise manner, not try to waffle too much. This is something I signpost my students to them. It's a resource around how do we have good dialogue. As opposed, like sometimes debate is good, but here this resource here kind of shows like how debate can sometimes be aggressive, while a dialogue can be civil. And it kind of shows you look the different attributes and different characteristics that you can have to have a healthy discussion, to have an open dialogue. And on that, then I have, I suppose, another dilemma that I would use here, and this is around looking at maybe a reviewer's feedback from a publication where they're not happy with your interpretation of confidence intervals, and they're basically, I'm paraphrasing this, but they're basically saying that your results are flawed. And that can be quite sensitive, because you might have spent a lot of time with you might have spent a lot of time doing your analysis, and you might be quite rigorous, and now somebody independent is saying it's flawed. And how do you not take that personal? And what way should you maybe be handling this? And this is something I would discuss with the students. Look, do you go back hard with them and have a detailed rebuttal to why the reviewer has made a mistake? Now, firstly, maybe the reviewer has made a mistake as well. And reviewers and editors can make mistakes. There's no doubt about it. But I mean, they can be open to that correction as well if you approach it in the right way. And that's something I would really encourage the students. Like if you feel that you're right, if you feel that maybe you're being wronged in some way, how do you handle it is really important. And which is ultimately focusing on maybe having kind of a thoughtful response. Here, another option: do you make small edits to avoid confrontation? Well, that kind of very much speaks to dilemma one as well. Like if you know something is wrong, it's there's no not knowing it as well. So it's important and responsible to be following up on it. Do you acknowledge the concern, clarify your wording, and thank the reviewer? That to me would obviously is the kind of the direction I would be leaning towards. Or if you feel that that's not going to be helpful, maybe you reach out to the editor for advice on balancing civility with rigor. And I suppose C and D here would be kind of two options. No, we're looking at 3 sentences up above. Like, I mean, in reality, there's going to be a lot more context to this, and it's not as simple to do it on one slide. But you can kind of get the idea to this. And then I suppose what I'm just going to finish up with, and I have a couple of slides here, but I won't go through them all because I said I didn't want to. I suppose I felt it was important that I wanted to share ultimately. I'm trying to think of what to say. I wanted to share, I suppose, how I would find these things that I'm mapping out here around grokking the data and around having civil discourse. How does that inform me? And ultimately, how do we see that there could be potentially a change? And ultimately, I suppose how I feel it comes down to is a lot of leadership. That leadership could be a senior management in an institution. That leadership could be through a supervisor. That leadership could be through somebody that's giving a lecture as well. And I suppose this a study that I did, and this is the one that I would have met Carl with then with the Frontiers research metrics analysis, would have looked at getting over 20 senior researchers in the room. This would have been a virtual room at the time, and looked at asking them a question around what do they see as good practice for training supervisors and leadership. And we would have broken up into kind of 3 categories of what do you find works well, what are the challenges, and how do you assess effectiveness. And we set it up as a world cafe where we broke them up into 3 groups. One group went off into the first what works well. They spoke there for a couple of minutes, then moved off into another group. And there was that kind of rotation. And I just thought what would be interesting there is just maybe so this is a graphic harvest that we got to summarize it, which was in the paper. The link is over there in the chat. But look, there's loads of different things, and obviously I am actually cherry picking here for the purposes of this presentation, but it is just obviously to link in how I suppose some of my own current research links into grokking the data and civil discourse. Over here on the left hand side, good communication is key. To when you're talking about what works well, it is essential for good communication. If I move over to here, what are the challenges? Often the challenges could be that there might need to be better signposting to where to actually go. And if I move over a small bit more, and hopefully I'm not disorientating anybody by zooming in too much, this one here, how do we assess effectiveness? I just thought was interesting and very much linked to this talk here is communities of practice, which is kind of where, again, people are coming together, like-minded individuals, and communicating findings as well. I have a couple of slides I thought, and I'm just going to keep, I know now I started a bit late, but I don't want to kind of be running over. Carl, what do you think? Maybe 3 more minutes? Would that be okay for your own timing?
Yeah. Seán, you're giving a wonderful presentation. Please take your time. We've got plenty of time.
Okay, super. Look, I'll show these because there's a couple of graphic harvests that are nice. I just thought,
please take your time.
Okay, super. Thanks, Carl. Thanks for that. Perfect. Okay, so I just thought then when I was prepping for this to like it's like everything is kind of rosy in the garden to a certain extent, you know, like if we have a statistical analysis plan, you know, if we do that at the start, everything kind of works out. We should have a civil discourse. But then in reality, there's often challenges, there's often obstacles. And I just thought something that is very, very topical at the moment. And it's interesting, Carl mentioned the World Conference on Research Integrity there. And I know he mentioned about his own experience, but the one that's in Vancouver next year, research security is kind of one of their top main topics, which is interesting because it is quite a global concern. And ultimately, I do see this as something, not necessarily an obstacle, but something that's going to, I suppose, we have to be careful with when it comes to our civil discourse, because research security, and this is a definition that we're working with in Ireland at the moment, is about preventing undesirable transfer of sensitive knowledge, technology, and research data, ethical or integrity violations, where knowledge is used to suppress or undermine our values and fundamental rights, and malign influences that infringe academic freedom and research integrity. Now, that's an absolute mouthful, but I thought it might be interesting just to see the definition that we're looking at. But ultimately, to paraphrase it, like research security is where there's now concern around collaboration, that when you're kind of collaborating, which is ultimately communicating your findings, are you being careful with that? Like there's actually this big kind of concern around communicating your findings now, that could they be used for malicious purposes, which is dual use. That moves into expert controls, which is a subset of research security. But if you're looking at sharing your findings, could somebody maybe take your findings and plagiarize them and stuff like that? There's this kind of real scare around it, and I'm not fully aligned with it personally myself, and maybe others are, and which is absolutely fine. I'd be interested to hear that. Like I would feel to a certain extent, like absolutely research security is important, but I feel if we're conducting our research with integrity and with ethical awareness, that we maybe already have this kind of covered to a certain extent. And I just thought it would be useful just to see, look, this is something that's quite topical. It could be seen as something that will be an obstacle or a hurdle to having civil discourse. This here image that I have here comes from a working group from the G7 that worked on integrity and research security. And I just thought they looked at having the link between them, which is over on the left hand side. Research security involves the actions to identify and protect research from activities and behaviors that compromise its integrity. And it's, to a certain extent, it's a case of, I suppose, is it trying to stop us collaborating, or because is it kind of creating another hurdle? Up here, they're mentioning different things. Look, you have to be careful with risk mitigation measure. You need to have that in place. You need to have risk management in place, and you need to be conducting due diligence. And all of these are supremely important, really important. I'm not disagreeing, but the fact that they're kind of calling it out as this new area, I just really would be wondering, like, do we need to have, we'll say, research integrity, research ethics, and now research security, along with all these other things? Like, is there not a way that maybe they could align together? And it was a bit of research that I did there, and that's what the second link is about, how we could maybe look at leadership that unites integrity and ethics for research security. So it was just a bit of research that I was done, because I ultimately feel it links in very much with collaboration. And I'll leave this slide actually because there's no need for this one, but it links into collaboration, which is obviously linking into this talk. So I'll leave this slide there because that was just different thoughts around research security. But maybe just to look at another one, I have two more graphic harvests and then we'll stop. So another one that could maybe impact civil discourse would be around the use of Gen AI. So like obviously, and what I mean for that, obviously this is civil discourse following rigorous analysis. It's basically to ensure that you're the one that's doing the rigorous analysis, as opposed to an AI doing the rigorous analysis. So we just have to be careful that when we're engaging with people, you know, like making sure that we're doing it right, that we're following, you know, doing the rigorous analysis, that we are looking at that whole iceberg. We're not just maybe looking at the tip of the iceberg and maybe a layer underneath, which is called Gen AI. So we should just be careful there. And I'm not saying anybody in the room would be thinking otherwise, but I just think it's when we're engaging with people. And I thought part of this graphic harvest that might be of interest here is if we're looking at dependent on AI for grokking the data for us, which it can do, does it actually diminish? I ultimately think it would diminish our own critical thinking. In my mind, it would, for sure, because there's so much learning from grokking the data. And if we look at using AI to grok the data, we miss out on a lot of that learning. But yet it's there, and there's no avoiding it. And then the last thing maybe to talk about, this is just two slides that are linked together, is another study that I'd be involved in is MTU is a university in Europe, but we're part of a European alliance as well with 10 other universities. And we're kind of encouraged to be collaborating with colleagues across these 10 universities. And what I led out on then is a study around, look, if we're going to collaborate, are we all singing from the same hymn sheet? How do we ensure that everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet when it comes to good research practice? I can just zoom in a small bit here, maybe in this one. And it's basically, how do we kind of can we have trust in our collaboration? And ultimately, what we try to do, what I basically led out on, is us having this Munster statement, which is the Munster statement on the principles of research ethics and research integrity. And this was the first part of the kind of, I suppose, to ensure everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet. And ultimately, we end up creating this statement, and I'll show you just the cover of the 10 statements that we have. But maybe just to say, look, what our European alliance, so this is Europe over there on the right hand side. Ireland is the one that's up here, the green one, and the kind of the top left hand corner. We have colleagues then in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, Romania, Finland, Sweden, Germany, France. I think I actually named everyone there. There's somebody I didn't name. Romania. I can't. Oh my, there's one that escapes me anyway, sorry. But ultimately, what we ended up doing then is we ended up creating these agreements, this statement, and translating it across all languages as well, to have it as open as possible, accessible as possible, and understandable as possible, which really I would hope would help with the transparency and the collaboration. We mentioned research security, but mention how we can overcome research security by if we conduct our research with responsibility, and this is linking in with research integrity and ethics. And obviously, that's my role at the moment, is very much like that. There's another dilemma. I leave that go though, because I'm happy to share it maybe in the Q&A if anyone wants to maybe see it, but I leave it just looking at the time. And just the final takeaways that I would have had when it comes to going back to the title of grokking the data and hearing each other. It is so important, so important to understand your data. I don't think AI can understand the data for you. It can help maybe, but it doesn't give you that understanding. When you're communicating your findings, be open for critiquing, be ready for that, but listen to others and listen to their interpretation, because maybe the lens that they're looking at the data is going to be a different lens to you, and maybe that will actually help improve the overall presentation of findings. And it's all about communicating responsibly, and as in communicating our findings responsibly. And look, that's essentially where we are with this. I hope that it was the right tone. I'm very happy to take any questions anyone may have, and I'll try to stop the share there so I can just see as well.
Thank you so much, Seán, for an incredible presentation. I fully share your goals and your vision. I didn't use the word security, perhaps I should have, but some of the IETF protocols that I mentioned that are necessary for doing what we talked about in the previous session with Ghana, they necessarily require security for all the reasons that we discussed in the session with Ghana. So with that, I do want to clarify that I never said that I would not go back to WCRI, and I would like everybody to be aware that if we're going to do something and sing the same hymn, I'm more than happy to sing the same hymn with you, but we are going to have to move very, very fast because the deadline is only 5 days away. The next deadline for WCRI is on October 15th. So we got 5 days. Now, I know Paul has a question, so please, Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent presentation. There's two things I'm looking at as a resource. You mentioned a European code of conduct in the very beginning. Where would I find that? Because it's going to need some adjective. There's probably a lot of European codes of conduct. Which conduct are you talking about? Does it use the word research?
For research integrity.
Okay, for research
integrity. So if you type in European Code of Conduct for research integrity, you should find it. So ALLEA, ALLEA, they're the group that would have led out in it.
Okay, and then the second is, I'm fascinated that the people in Rotterdam have this dilemma game. Can you give me a little more keywords for my search on that?
You know what I'll do there, because I mean it can be a bit tricky. Actually, when Carl sends the slides, I think the slides will be shared. That image that I have for the dilemma game, it's hyperlinked, so when you click on it, you'll get sent there. Okay. But what I will do anyway to cover all the bases, I'll email Carl after this. I'll email him the link to the European Code of Conduct and to the Rotterdam that dilemma game as well.
Perfect.
And
Thank you so
and
much.
So that will avoid that.
we will be making the slide decks publicly available for download from the Guardian's program page. So what we have done every year is we provide links to the slide deck, links to the video, and for all participants, contributors who'd like to write a full manuscript, we would also provide the link to the full manuscript, which will be in our Brainiacs journal. So just a reminder to everybody who wants to turn their presentation into a written manuscript, we're happy to publish it in Brainiacs. Other questions?
Just a comment. And those of us who are not statisticians, but we deal with data all the time, always have to be worried about how the data is being interpreted. And I really appreciated your talk and the clarity of your vision of how to use data and how to do it with integrity and hopefully truth. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. That's lovely. And hopefully, like, there's a link in one of the slides there to under statistical analysis planning, where there's some resources, slide decks, and videos around introducing it from the ground up. You know, not coming in at a high level, introducing it, look, the different types of data that's there. How do we collect data, and how would we may analyze it, and maybe that's of help as well. So that's in the slide deck. Thanks, Julie, for the feedback, though. That's lovely, and thanks, Paul, as well.
Anybody else? Well, I'll contribute one other comment from my own experience as in the role of statistician. It's not a joke that we get called in after the fact. I mean, I have definitely participated in clinical trials where I've been called in after the fact, and then I got to figure out a way to salvage what I can salvage in a manner consistent with, you know, my training in mathematics and statistics and respect for integrity and truth. And so that's not always an easy thing. I just wanted to confirm that it's not a joke. It really does happen. So certainly, if we can change that and get people who run clinical trials, if we can get brought in at the beginning of the clinical trial. Now, I know standards are improving at IRBs and elsewhere, and more and more IRBs are insisting that the statistics protocol be included necessarily in the clinical trial protocol. But there are some situations where it's okay to declare it simply exploratory because the numbers are so low, your sample size is so low, you cannot do a proper statistical analysis, and you have to declare that in advance, and then just say, well, this is an exploratory analysis, and we are not going to be doing any formal statistical analysis because the sample size is so small. So I concur with everything you presented. With that minor amendment to situations where your clinical trial has such, and that actually happens to be the case for our current clinical trial, which we call the EPSMS study. So we have declared in advance that we are not going to be doing anything other than exploratory analysis. So there will be no claim of statistical significance on anything.
And like from my point of view, then, Carl, like, to me that's perfect, because you know, this is not everything's up front then, and ultimately it's
Yes,
transparent. Look, we're collecting the data, we know it's small, this is where we're going to go, and we're not going to go any further. And
correct.
then
Yeah,
once that's called out and then it's followed through, then that is good practice. Like, exploratory analysis is good practice as well. I mean, like, ultimately exploratory analysis is sometimes needed to form your hypothesis. But if we're upfront with that's what we're doing, then, you know, that's encouraged ultimately. Then that's a
yeah.
good addition. Thanks for adding
In
that in.
our particular study, the EPSMS study, we're doing medical imaging that has never been done before. So It's not yet even determined what kind of medical imaging data analysis we're going to be doing on the actual medical images because it's never been done before. So it
Yeah,
necessarily has to be exploratory. So
brilliant. Very good.
any
All the
other
best with it.
final comments before we close this session, and we'll take a 5-minute break again. Thanks again, Sean. I really appreciate it. And shout out again to you and Ghana. Maybe we can put something together in the next 5 days and put it into WCRI. So let's see what we can do. All right. All right. Okay, I'm going to close the session.
So
We'll take a 5-minute break.
thanks everyone.
Oh,
Bye bye.
bye-bye. Bye-bye.